My name is Zsuzsanna Végh. I'm a researcher at the Center for EU Enlargement Studies, and I have here with me on the panel Julian Lindley-French, who among other his many positions is currently director of Europa Analytica in Rotterdam. Also we have on the panel Amanda Paul, who is here from Brussels, from the European Policy Center. She's a researcher there working mostly on neighborhoods, including the Eastern neighborhood and Turkey, of course. And we also have here from Warsaw Grzegorz Gromadzki, Senior Fellow of the Stefan Batory Foundation. So we will continue the discussion on the Eastern Partnership from the EU's perspective. In the keynote speeches, we heard reference to the review process that is currently ongoing. The European Commission and the European External Action Service is collecting ideas on how to reshape the neighborhood policy in broader terms, and the Riga summit, the approaching Riga summit, is actually giving a great occasion to focus a little bit more on how the Eastern Partnership itself, so the Eastern dimension of the neighborhood policy of the EU, could be reformulated. And based on the previous two panels, I believe we got the answer to the question whether it should be. It is definitely on the agenda. It should be reformed. We heard really excellent informative assessments from representatives of the EaP countries, and this is not my task, luckily, to summarize that. I will leave that to my boss, Péter Balázs, who will do the concluding remarks after this panel. And what I found very important is that we heard a lot about challenges, not just achievements. We heard about challenges that are posed by external actors, Russia. We also heard about internal challenges, and that we cannot blame Russia for everything, of course. There are challenges in all of the EaP states. And also, if we want to be honest, the EU itself is facing quite significant challenges in its responses, in its policy towards the Eastern neighborhood. So in this panel, referring back to Richard, I don't want to ask the speakers to draw conclusions, but rather to continue with the discussion and try to come up with ideas how the EaP could and should be reformed, and whether they see that the European Union and member states can step up their efforts to answer some of those pressing issues that the previous panels have raised. So with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Julian, who will be talking about the more strategic perspective.
Thank you, Zsuzsanna. I must admit, asking me to talk from the EU perspective is a bit like asking Genghis Khan to talk about soft power, but having worked for Javier Solana, I will give my perspective anyway. Fascinating day, a different day. I chaired and was rapporteur for a big NATO meeting in Rome last week on the future of warfare, and it's almost like we're in two different Europes, I have to say, given the perspectives that we've had here, and I was dealing with on Friday. I think this room should understand the message of today, which is that the Eastern Partnership is grand strategy. It really is part of the shape, the future shape of Europe. And if we don't understand that, if we see it as a technical adjustment or yet another joint action stroke program stroke project, I think that, by its definition, will undermine it. But I sense that our politicians, particularly our Western European politicians with whom I spend quite a lot of time, they don't get this. They kind of move on. As you know, we have a little local difficulty in London or in Britain tomorrow in our general election, which will probably elect nobody. But I've been struck by how little Europe or the wider shape of international relations has been a theme throughout the entire election campaign, as though it was not there at all. And this complacency worries me. 2015 is one of those inflection points in Europe's now long story. In fact, these next few days are really 70 years on from where it really began. We have May the 8th coming up, which is Victory in Europe Day, and I will write a piece contrasting Churchill's great speech on VE Day with the speech of either Miliband or Cameron, which will give you some idea what I'm going to say. But also on May the 9th we have Victory Day, and I do think it's important when we have these debates, and I point this to you, sir, that we pay respect to Russia and to Russians and the role that they played in the Great Patriotic War. I think it's really important at this moment of friction that respect is maintained, particularly historical respect, because that's the foundation upon which solutions are found, if we start simply shouting at each other. But of course in 1950 we had the European Coal and Steel Community, we had 1989, the end of the Cold War. In 2014 we had Ukraine. Now you can argue the rights and wrongs of Ukraine, but it is an inflection point. It moves the goalposts. So whether it's 2003 in the neighbourhood policy or 2009 when EaP was launched, the strategic context of all those policies is shifting. And if we don't understand the nature of that shift, then I think we are in for failure, which kind of brings me to my core message that I want to impart today. And it's one that I gave to senior NATO commanders and senior NATO officials last week in Rome, which is, if you look at the shift away from liberal power to illiberal power, both state and non-state, the next decade could destroy all the assumptions that you have in this room about our ability to influence virtually anything. If we haven't got the underlying tools of influence, that includes soft and hard power, if we haven't got the political will, if we haven't got the unity of effort and purpose, then we'll go on churning out nice documents, we'll have nice meetings, and I hope Riga will be more of that, but the actual credibility we will have as actors to influence our own environment. And when you talk about the Eastern Partnership, you can't really talk about the Eastern Partnership without considering what's happening on our southern flank as well. But these are big strategic shifts. And we've got to have the necessary ambition to deal with that. Which brings me to Riga, if I may, Zsuzsanna. And I've got several points to make. First is understanding. Riga, in a way, is on the front line. The front line between what I genuinely believe is a communitarian concept of international relations, which the EU brings. There is something new in this. There is something new that we genuinely do not any longer, between EU member states, exist in a kind of explicit balance of power politics, which is inherently unstable. There is something that institutions and rules really have helped to stabilize this continent 70 years on. And having been in Moscow and met senior Russians, and it's not as though our Russian friends are trying it on. There is a different strategic culture in Moscow, a genuinely different strategic culture, which is, shall we say, more classical, more traditional, does believe in balances of power, of interests, in the way that perhaps, because we've become so socialized in the European Union, we've kind of moved on from that. And I sometimes think that we tend to think the rest of the world is like us. In fact, we're the revolutionaries here. We're the ones that come up with an entirely new way of doing business internationally. And when I go to New Delhi or to China, or much of the time I spend in Washington, believe me, they're often much closer to the Moscow worldview in terms of the way that international relations is conducted than we are with our communitarian model. So I think we have to try to see through our own perspective to gain the understanding of others if we are to move on. Second, Ukraine. We can't avoid it. Ukraine, Riga will be dominated by Ukraine. It's there. It's the friction point of contemporary international relations, the Schwerpunkt, if you like. Now, in a sense, we've got to move towards a new political settlement. And for all the discussion just now, which I found fascinating about the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union, for all the relative likes and dislikes. It does strike me that in diplomacy, when you're in a hole you want to get out of it, stop digging. Look for something else to talk about. And I am struck by this line that Chancellor Merkel came up, that whilst we must maintain the pressure over Ukraine, and I have to say, I said to you, sir, over the break, that I think Russia has made a profound mistake in its actions in Ukraine. But nevertheless, we still have to maintain some kind of dialogue and some basis for dialogue, and this could be it. A reformed EU meets a reformed Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, there is something there to discuss, and that will have to be considered. My sadness, and I have to be blunt about this, is that Moscow's actions in Ukraine have delayed what was going to be a debate anyway by at least 5 to 10 years. And that 5 to 10 years could be dangerous. It could be unstable. It could be a difficult period, as we've seen in actions. 3, leadership. And this is an internal challenge. Riga, to my mind, should be the moment when Central and Eastern European EU member states stand up and lead. You're no longer new members, and I get irritated by this sort of new member thing. I mean, it's now, we're moving on. Partly because it's about this region. Secondly, because London and Paris have to a large extent lost the leadership plot. London's going to be out of it for 5 more years at least, messing around in its own miserable grief. Paris is in decline right now, and will have to deal with its own particular Gallic form of grief. And Germany is profoundly schizophrenic about the role of leadership. And therefore, those members represented in this room from Central and Eastern European EU member states should not look too hard to the West for leadership, because it ain't going to get it. In fact, I would say we need a Western partnership these days, because when I talk to Western European politicians, or indeed Western European publics, my Dutch neighbours, for example, there's now a profound cynicism about the EU. What's it for? What benefits we gain? It's got to be re-injected, reinvigorated with some belief. 4, strategic patience. None of the stuff we've discussed today is going to happen quickly. This is a long-term project. Now, I would hope it's a long-term project that should have been consensual, cooperative. That was indeed the initiative. I fear for a time it's going to be adversarial, because the 7th missing partner is, of course, Russia from the Eastern Partnership. There is no real Eastern Partnership per se without Russia somehow being closely associated with it. But when I think about how we transfer standards of governance, which the EU rightly upholds, it will take a very long time, it will take significant funding, and a lot of strategic patience, political patience. And I was in Afghanistan several times during the last 10 years. And the one thing that struck me was the lack of strategic patience amongst our respective political classes. We had that famous quote that one senior Pashtun elder said to me, which was famous, probably Taliban, you know, you have the watches and we have the time. A kind of same goes for us in Eastern Europe. 5, managing expectations. And I fear, listening to this conversation today, the growing desperation of certain partners about just what kind of deal they're going to get from the EU. We've really got to deliver what we say we're going to deliver. At the same time, we have to be clear about what we cannot deliver. But I do want to see Riga not just draw a baseline, but re-inject some political momentum in that process with realism. 6, and here I have to be absolutely blunt, sir, because I do a lot of this, and I'm looking at Russian forces very carefully. Deterring hybrid warfare. I can go into chapter and verse about the Western military oblast, the modernization of the Russian military program, the use of disinformation, destabilization, and coercion, intimidation, with both conventional and nuclear forces. And I ask myself why. If Russia could reasonably make an argument for having moved into Ukraine on the grounds of stabilizing the situation, But then to carry on with this kind of snap exercises, aggressive military posture, which I have chapter and verse of, strikes me as undermining any claim Russia has right now to being constructive. You know, there's going to be an incident in the next few weeks. There was nearly one last week with an RAF Typhoon, with a Russian aircraft. This cannot happen. I was at Schiphol Airport the day that MH17 was shot down. I walked past the people on that plane. And I don't think Moscow at times understands the negative messaging this kind of behavior sends. And that's not to attack Russia per se, it's simply saying the strategy is wrong. And if Russia really wants a dialogue, a political dialogue, this kind of behavior must end, period. End of story. Because I can tell you from my discussion with senior NATO commanders, we will respond. And then the dialogue becomes not about a political solution, but about forward deterrence, forward defence, and the militarisation of European security. And that cannot be in Russia's interest. It's not in our interest. So I speak to you as a representative of the Russian state, with respect, and I have indeed deep respect, but we've got to change this narrative because it's very dangerous indeed. 7, moving towards my conclusion, Chair. Am I in time?
Yes.
Very good. Yes. We have to be honest about our own political constraints. This white knight thing, it kind of irritates me because we have our own problems too. Take, for example, the free movement of people, the liberalisation of visas issue, which is clearly hugely important. I can tell you, back in Western Europe, with the whole issue of the migration across the Mediterranean, this is toxic politics. And our politicians are not going to touch it. I mean, look what happened with HMS Bulwark this weekend. She gets down into the Mediterranean on Friday. She sits for 3 days doing nothing because we couldn't agree the actual status of the migrants that the Bulwark might put up. Because technically they'd be standing foot on a British warship, therefore they'd be entering the UK. For 3 days she sat doing nothing and people died. And now we have a bilateral agreement with Italy to transfer them to Italy. Now, it's very easy in rooms like this to talk about nice, neat solutions like free movement. But the politics of that right now is still very toxic in most Western European countries. So it's going to be a reality that we have to be honest about. 8, blame Russia for Russian actions, but do not blame Russia for everything. I think Richard and James said that very clearly. Are we honest enough in our own right to admit the limits to partnership and association agreements? Andre made the point about carrots. What carrots are we offering compared to our Russian colleagues? Are we honest enough to be really assertive with our partners about the reforms or lack of them? Are we honest enough, 2 minutes, very good, Chairman, to admit limits to our own political ambition and thus our own contradictions? Because what I've also heard today is a massive contradictions between ambition and political reality. And that has to be eased, that has to be addressed. 9, 1 more minute to go, Riga. As I said, Riga will be dominated by Ukraine, but there still needs to be some vision statement, a commitment, a clear statement that the partnership programme means something, that the Eastern Partnership has a series of deliverables which will be on offer to all our partners, because ultimately this point about the community model versus realpolitik versus spheres of influence, the fundamental issue at stake in our contention with Moscow is this, that sovereign peoples have free choice to make the choices that they so wish to make. That's the point we are defending, and that's the point we are always defending, and must always defend. And I will conclude, number 10, with a quote from Winston Churchill. You would expect nothing less than a quote from Winston Churchill this great week, when he said, "We may permit ourselves a brief moment of rejoicing." He also said, and I quote, "True genius resides in the capacity for the evaluation of conflicting, unnecessary and hazardous information." And I would paraphrase that. True genius resides in the capacity of our union, for action in conflicting, uncertain and hazardous times. We are in conflicting, uncertain and hazardous times, and we must learn as a union to act, because too often we only act in the easy times. But what I'm seeing, and I'll leave you with this, from our political masters with whom I must work, is a kind of sacrificing strategy for politics. Indeed, if I wanted to characterize my own country's general election campaign, it is the systematic sacrificing of strategy for politics. What we need is strategy, not politics. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Julian. Also, thank you for pointing out the need for strategic vision, finally, in this indeed very important policy area of the European Union. And I think your paraphrased Churchill quote was indeed an excellent point to finish up with. So on that note, I would pass the floor to Amanda to continue with the...
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to all the organisers for inviting me here today. It's the first time I was actually in Budapest, so that makes it an even greater pleasure. I'm also going to talk about Riga and the Riga Declaration, to be more precise. But first of all, I would just like to start by saying there's something that does make me feel particularly disappointed by the EU. I mean, over the past 12 months, we've heard numerous statements from numerous leaders saying how they stand shoulder to shoulder with the Eastern Partnership countries, etc. But nearly 1 year since the association agreements and DCFTAs were signed, I think we have to look how many member states still haven't actually ratified those agreements in full or in partial, and I think that's actually shameful, and it actually undermines the credibility of the EU. Of course, there's a couple of member states who are doing it just before Riga, a sort of last-minute dash, including the one I know the best, my own country, the UK, and I think France as well. But I think it's still pretty a bad thing that it's done so late. Now, coming to the main point, to Riga and the Riga Declaration. I mean, the Riga Declaration is supposed to reflect the ambition and the commitment of the EU and the Eastern Partnership countries. This declaration should recognise the complete change of the geopolitical situation since Vilnius. This is what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to send a strong message to the Eastern Partnership countries, particularly to Ukraine. But having looked at the draft declaration, and of course this is not a critique of the Latvian presidency, because I know very well how hard Latvia has actually been working over the last months. I have to say that I'm really, disappointed. I mean, it's an incredibly weak document. I don't know how many of you have actually seen it, but what actually surprises me is not just the fact that it doesn't really give a strong message. Some parts of it seem to have been even copy and pasted from the Vilnius summit declaration, big parts of it. I mean, the Vilnius one was actually longer. This one's shorter. I mean, when it comes to Ukraine, for example, on the first page, there's 1.5 lines. It doesn't reflect. If you didn't know there was a war in Ukraine, you wouldn't know, because it simply doesn't reflect that. And I think this is incredibly wrong. Of course, we can say this reflects the fact that the EU doesn't, well, it says it has solidarity on the topic, but clearly it doesn't really have solidarity. Of course, this reflects the fact of 28 member states having different opinions, but the fact that they come up with, I know it's only a draft, but the fact that they can come up with such a weak starting document sends a very wrong message. On the other side now, I think you also have the issue of the Eastern Partnership countries themselves, because in the past, to a certain degree, or to quite a large degree, you had a strong solidarity between the countries that they wanted to achieve the same objectives on a number of different issues. Now, the situation here has totally changed, because as we know, you have 3 countries who are moving very strongly. Then you have Armenia and Belarus, who are the Eurasian Union. Then you have Azerbaijan. I mean, unfortunately, the Eurasian participants are trying to water down the declaration, or so it seems, if you would see some of the amendments that are being put in, which I think is a further complicating fact when trying to send out a strong message. I mean, I can understand why they would wish to do that, because obviously it's under pressure from Russia, or fear of what the repercussions could be from Russia with a very strong statement from the EU. So I think these two forces show, I mean, from the side of the Eastern Partnership countries, it shows that there needs to be a new mechanism of splitting these countries up, because it's not sustainable to have them all together for the long run. I mean, I don't precisely know how this is going to end up, because I would agree actually with what Richard said earlier, that we need to keep the Eastern Partnership policy as a whole, but there definitely needs to be some sort of differentiation, whether that can be sort of like a second sort of policy, I don't know. And again, the situation with Azerbaijan is also quite bizarre, because the EU has the strangest sort of policy to Azerbaijan. Because on one day, they're telling the Azerbaijanis, you're the best partner we have, you're a strategic partner, you're fantastic, you're great. And then the next day, they're criticizing the human rights situation in civil society. And I think, again, they really need to sort themselves out over what sort of policy they want to have with Azerbaijan, because the current one is neither good for the EU, its credibility, or for Azerbaijan, frankly speaking. So this is something that I think needs to be considered further. Now, just going into Riga, I mean, I have a number of points here that I think the EU should do. I mean, first of all, there clearly needs to be a very strong message to those countries that are committed to reform, to really show them there's a path beyond association, sort of transforming it to a path of integration. I mean, that doesn't mean giving, I mean, I would love them all to be given a clear membership perspective, to have it written in Riga, but I think we know this is not going to happen, but they do need to have something to keep them motivated, and more importantly, to keep the transformative power of the EU alive. So I would actually agree with what Dimitros said earlier about taking some of the pre-accession tools and applying them to these countries, because if they're not getting a membership perspective, I think this can be something that's quite tangible. The second point is related to security. I mean, at the moment, the Eastern Partnership doesn't have security as a key focus, and this needs to be integrated into the policy. Starting, for example, with the situation in Ukraine. I mean, the OSCE mission in Ukraine, I mean, all due respect to the OSCE, I'm sorry to say, but it's not doing the job that it's supposed to. Everybody knows that. Unfortunately, the EU tend to use this OSCE as a sort of feel-good mechanism. Oh, the OSCE is there, is doing something, so it parks the problem. It means the EU doesn't have to think about it. But I mean, I honestly believe there is a need for a serious consideration of having some sort of EU mission on the ground. I'm very glad that President Tusk has suggested that they would do some sort of field trip to assess the situation on the ground. That's obviously not assessing the OSCE, but again, the situation on the ground, because it's not sustainable. I mean, the Russians use the OSCE as a tool for themselves. So, I mean, I believe that if there's no change, if the OSCE mission cannot be allowed to do the job that it's tasked to do, i.e. monitoring fully the situation in Donetsk and etc., and also not allowed to go into Crimea, which I consider to be also important, then next year it shouldn't be continued, its mandate. They need to find some sort of a mission on the ground. The other thing relevant, I think, to security is about the so-called frozen conflicts, particularly the ones in the South Caucasus. Actually, in the 2003 security strategy, the EU does actually say that it wants to take a stronger role in the security situation and conflict resolution in the South Caucasus. I didn't see very much evidence of that, but it's in there. But I think, you know, the EU again needs to stop hiding behind the OSCE and other mechanisms down there and really step up, because if we don't resolve, I mean, these conflicts, I mean, they are the greatest impediment to security in the entire region. And I think there's a need for, you know, the bigger member states, particularly Germany, for example, who has expressed a wish to be more involved in conflict resolution, to actually follow through on that. Because at the moment, we know that these conflicts are used by Russia as platforms to project power. First of all, through their military presence, but also by ruling and dividing the leaderships of the countries and those separate states. I mean, I know that, for example, President Putin will have a meeting with President Aliyev and possibly with the Armenian president as well in a couple of days' time. Again, they're going to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia has proved that it's not a conflict resolver. It's a conflict creator or a state builder. I think the EU does need to take a much stronger lead and actually saying, you know, we want to do something. We want to have a troika between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and rather than just saying we're satisfied with the efforts of the OSCE Minsk group. I mean, I just don't think this is good enough. And obviously also if you're talking about security, again, security sector reform, police reform, judicial reform, I think it's areas where the EU could do much more. Again, coming to energy security, I think the EU needs to bring these countries, Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia, as close as possible into the energy union, also along with Turkey, because I think it's in everybody's benefits, because at the end of the day, we all have the same aim to guarantee our energy security. They also need to come up with some proper policy regarding Turkish Stream, because there seems to be, again, you know, a multi-pronged response to this. You have some representatives of the EU saying Turkish Stream's a joke, it's not going to go ahead, it's a waste of time. But at the same time, you have a number of EU member states who are actually signing up to it. And the fact that they want to sign up to it totally undermines actually the objectives of the energy union in the first place. Just waiting to see whether the Turkish Stream is actually going to be built or not, again, is not the response. They need to be formulating an approach to that now. Do we accept Turkish Stream? Under what conditions do we accept it, or do we not accept it? I think there's scope for more approach to building ties with societies in these countries, which is something that the EU hasn't been particularly strong at. I mean, the EU remains, you know, very attractive, even in countries like Azerbaijan. The EU is attractive. It's far more attractive than Russian propaganda. Yes, I'm coming to the end very shortly. No obstacles, please, for visa liberalisation. You know, there's many rumours flying around now in Brussels, maybe even more rumours that, you know, Georgia and Ukraine's processes are going to be, you know, held up. The issue of the, you know, the not closed border in Ukraine is going to be used as an impediment. I think this would be a mistake. This is something that's very tangible and needs to be delivered. And I'm just getting to the final 2 points. First of all, the no stalling on the provisional application of Ukraine's DCFTA. We know that Russia has asked for it to be extended for another year, and some member states actually agree with Russia, big member states actually. This is, you know, very disturbing. And finally, I want to talk just for 1 second about this neighbour of neighbours. At the beginning, a lot of countries were mentioned, Russia, the Gulf, Central Asia, but I think actually the most important country in this is actually Turkey. Richard mentioned about Turkey and Armenia, but I think it goes much beyond that, because Turkey is actually playing a role in the South Caucasus. It actually has an integration project with Azerbaijan and Georgia, but yet there's absolutely no cooperation between the EU and Turkey in this region or in the Black Sea region at all. And I think this is a missed opportunity. Of course, this is possibly a result of the, let's say, difficult relationship between Turkey and the EU at the moment, which you could also say is a result of short-sighted EU policies. But Turkey is a key regional player. It has a key stake in that region, as I said, in the Caucasus and in the Black Sea. And I think it's in Turkey's interest, the EU and the Eastern Partnership countries, that Turkey is brought on board in a far more larger fashion and cooperative way than it is at the moment. So with that, I'm sorry for being too long, and that's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually following up on the key areas that you pointed out where the EU should focus on and where more attention should be paid, I would like to refer to a recent research that we have been working on, the trends of Eastern Partnership, and I would like to encourage you all to check it out on our website. We did a very big survey in 10 countries, the 6 EaP countries and the 4 V4 countries, surveying foreign policy elites working on the Eastern Partnership. And with regards to security, this was one of the areas that was mentioned where the EaP was severely underperforming. In the area of energy security, only 39% of the respondents from the 10 countries sorry, actually said that there has been any progress. And with regards to the areas that you mentioned further, mobility, visa facilitation, indeed, this was one of the sectors that was referred to by most EaP countries, where they actually expect more openness and more engagement from the European Union in the future, and where they would like to see more resources being channeled to. So thank you very much for your contribution, and I would like to pass the floor now to Grzegorz, and I would also like to ask you to maybe follow up on what Julian was saying earlier about whether or not Central European countries should seek leadership in the West or should go forward themselves.
Thank you very much. I promise to touch this issue in the end of my presentation. But I would like to start with a short description of what is EaP, in my opinion. I think that EaP has been an official brand for a package of proposals from the EU side. Not new proposals, but interesting, in my opinion, namely association agreement with the DCFTA, visa-free regime, I think it was very important, and energy community membership of EaP countries. But I think that now we should think not about rethinking of the EaP, but rethinking the EU policy towards EaP countries. And, you know, Julian mentioned that we face new reality, in fact. And in my opinion, there are at least two crucial factors of this new reality in Eastern Europe for next several years at least, maybe even for decades. Namely, association agreement and DCFTA signed by 3 EaP countries, namely Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, as a first factor, and second factor, already mentioned several times, Russian military aggression in Ukraine, with 2 dimensions, annexation of Crimea and war in Donbass. And I think that the EU has to take seriously into consideration these 2 factors. First factor, association agreement and deep and comprehensive free trade area with 3 EaP countries. I think that completely new approach from the EU side towards these 3 countries is badly needed. Both sides, the EU on the one hand, and Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia on the other hand, should build relations at decisively higher level than until now, despite of EU internal problems, challenges, and despite of internal problems in EaP countries, which were, these problems were discussed during the first panel. Second factor, Russian aggression. I think that Putin regime simply cannot accept Ukraine's and others, Georgia's and Moldova's integration with the EU, the West as a whole. So Russia is not only strongly against NATO membership of those countries, but also their integration with the EU. It should be very clearly said, I think. Ukraine is perceived by Russian elite as a part of Moscow territory. So for Putin and political elite in Moscow, it is an internal and external issue at the same time. So I think that a rivalry, maybe better to say a clash between us, the EU, and Russia, due to completely different position on the future of EaP country, is inevitable. And probably this crisis, I think that Julian mentioned this crisis in EU-Russia relations will last several years at least, maybe even longer, a decade or more. Therefore, I think that sanctions EU sanctions should remain the principal tool of the Union in its policy towards Russia. The existing sanctions and the threat of implementation of new ones should be perceived as a tool that can help to restrain Russia from further actions against Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. They are a tool for containment, not a miraculous remedy to change the behavior of Russian ruling elite in the short term. The sanctions should not be waived until Russia has ceased completely its interference in Ukraine. The EU should maintain its unity in its sanctions policy towards Russia. It will be an extremely important challenge for the EU in this year. The Russian ruling elite takes seriously and respects only opponents who are able to pursue a consistent policy. Any sign of disunity is perceived by the Russian regime as a proof of weakness to be used to Russia's advantage. Now a few words about new shape of EaP EU policy towards East European countries. Few proposals. First of all, I think that the reshaped Eastern Partnership should be a much more politically oriented and less technically oriented process than it has been to date. Amanda mentioned this. I think I agree with you. The clear division of the EaP countries into two groups is badly needed. Those that signed association agreement, maybe even more than two groups, with the DCFTA on the one hand and the others on the other hand. More than ever, the EU has to focus its attention on relations with authorities of the partner countries that are willing to cooperate more closely and to embark upon deep integration with the EU. Such kind of approach would send a clear political signal and would amount to better use of our limited resources. The more for more principle should be further strengthened. It would be, in my opinion, a message to the others, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, that the EU is not interested in an artificial dialogue through the EaP that pays lip service to democracy and human rights while the partners continue to disregard fundamental freedoms and democratic values at home. One can say that a common denominator should be built at the level of three countries which signed association agreement with the DCFTA, not at the level of all 6 EaP countries. However, the general concept of the EaP, which includes association agreement, DCFTA, full visa liberalization, energy community membership, should remain open for all 6 countries, if they are ready to change course and demonstrate the political will to follow the leading 3 on the path to closer integration with the EU. In the case of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, the concept of the EaP should be used to send a strong political signal to the societies of those countries rather than to make unrealistic offers of cooperation with the current authorities in Yerevan and especially in Baku and Minsk. The existing EaP summits, for instance, should be maintained as a proof of goodwill from the EU side and as an important channel for cooperation and communication. However, they should be divided into 2 parts. The first part would be for only those countries that have signed association agreement, and the second part for all 6 EaP countries. Bilateral relations have to become a priority even more than now, bilateral relations between the EU and EaP countries. Building on the greater success of the bilateral track to date. Stronger exchange of experience should be introduced between those EaP countries engaged in implementation of the association agreement with the DCFTA. And the European Commission should become a facilitator of exchanges between Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia concerning their efforts in implementation of the association agreement, and especially, I think, DCFTA. Therefore, the multilateral dimension would be refocused to strengthen cooperation among the better performing countries. So I would propose a kind of model 3+, not 6, all 6 EaP countries. Amanda mentioned that the role of society and relations of the EU with society of EaP countries should be strengthened. I agree fully with your opinion. In my opinion, the 3 countries that signed association agreement should be perceived as more than partners. However, not in the same category as a candidate or accession countries. Nevertheless, a model similar to the accession process should be used in EU relations with those countries. I think that Dmytro mentioned this. Use of the Copenhagen criteria, for instance, would strengthen assessments of the process of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia in their efforts to implement association agreement and DCFTA. The lack of a membership perspective remains the most painful issue for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia in their relations with the EU. Therefore, the European Council should follow the European Parliament, which already declared that it is possible, and declare officially that those 3 countries, as European states, fall under Article 49 of the Lisbon Treaty. But I think that a well-implemented association agreement and DCFTA by those countries would give de facto an accession perspective for them. And finally, few words about cooperation of Visegrad countries in the shaping of EU policy towards EaP countries and Russia. I am very pessimistic, frankly speaking, because there are completely different approaches to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Poland, on the one hand, which support strongly Ukraine and support, for instance, sanctions against Russia, and other 3 countries, especially Hungary, on the other hand. So, frankly speaking, cooperation is not possible in the format of Visegrad Group in this respect, concerning some ideas about EU policy towards EaP countries. However, open and frank discussion between Visegrad countries is badly needed to keep the unity of EU as a whole, 28 member states. So, frankly speaking, I don't believe that so-called new member states can be leaders. Of course, Poland can build a bigger group of countries, especially with Baltic states. Probably also Sweden can join, but it is not a critical mass in the EU. So Germany is a crucial player here, because I think that without Germany, sanctions against Russia would be impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grzegorz, and also thank you for touching upon the Visegrad countries and Germany issue and their role in the policy formation. Before opening the floor now, I would like to give the opportunity to the speakers to react to each other if they would like to, and then we would collect questions and comments. Okay, in that case, we will open the floor, and I would also like to ask you that if you have any questions to Amanda, please put them forth because unfortunately she will have to leave in like 15 minutes.
My name is Rustam. I come from Abkhazia, and one of those frozen conflicts that have been mentioned in this part.
Yes,
It's on. So I actually have a question about the. We talked about a lot about the revision of the Eastern Partnership and the Riga Summit as a milestone, but to actually face the challenges that currently are in the partnership, and but at the same time, because. After the Eastern Partnership was launched, there was a policy which was called engagement without recognition that was applied to the situation in those frozen conflicts. Unfortunately, it was a failed policy. Would there be any chance of revision of that policy, because people living in those areas are still affected by isolation, and it's very difficult for them to travel or see any other perspective than actually the current events and the current realities in the region. So will there be any chance of the revision or a different approach, new approach to those frozen conflicts in the region? Because full integration, as I see it from this perspective of those respective countries, be that Georgia, Moldova, or Ukraine, would not be fully possible until the territorial issues are solved. Thank you very much.
James Nixie, Chatham House. One brief question for each of you, if I may. Julian, you started with a very important point about the need to pay respect to Russia in a historical context. I would just say, as you have a straighter shooter, I know, sir, then that does imply the need for disrespect for Russia's policy, for Russia's performance and policies since 1991, and particularly since 2012. Yep. But just since every yin must have its yang. Anyway, my real question to you, though, is the following: is that surely, on the basis of your comments about Russian hybrid warfare, then the NATO decision on the 2% of GDP is a very conventional response to a very unconventional problem. And I just wonder if you would agree with that. Yeah. Briefly, Amanda, Azerbaijan, the European schizophrenia towards Azerbaijan, absolutely. So perhaps I could just suggest to you, okay, remove it from the Eastern Partnership and be absolutely clear. It has no intention of reforming. It has no intention of doing of making the political reforms which are required of it. So surely we must draw some conclusions from that. And finally, sir, Mr. Gromadzki, then sanctions on Russia. You said you would link them to Russian destabilization of Ukraine. And firstly, I would say Russia will never stop destabilizing Ukraine. But to be specific and to ask you a specific question, then are you including Crimea? Are you actually saying that sanctions should remain on Russia until Russia leaves Crimea? Is that what you're saying? That's my question.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is András Dócifra, European Stability Initiative, and I'd have three short questions to the panel. So first of all, one of the important parts of the debate about the new Eastern Partnership seems to be flexibility versus, or what exactly flexibility should mean. Should it mean differentiation? Should it mean dividing the countries up to different categories? And my question to you would be whether you think flexibility in tools, that is, for example, the EU's enhancing the EU's capacities to react to sudden crisis in these countries. This could be flexibility could be enhanced here without bending the principles, the underlying principles of the Eastern Partnership, and maintaining a common sort of framework of principles. That's the first question. The second one concerns maintaining a dialogue or cooperation with civil society in the countries concerned. Whether you think the EU does enough to engage with civil society in these countries, because we know that in authoritarian regimes will sooner or later fall, maybe tomorrow, maybe in a couple of years, maybe in a decade, but they will. And one of the lessons I think that we should have learned from the Arab Spring is that if we don't engage with the civil society, with people, with the democratic part of the opposition, then when the regimes fall, we will be there empty-handed. So the second question is, how do you think the EU should enhance its cooperation with civil societies in these countries? And the third question is linked to this because the case of Azerbaijan was mentioned by many, and one of the obstacles there is exactly the same thing that happened in the southern Mediterranean, that the EU was sort of conniving with the regimes rather than being principled in this field. And the reason why the EU and the EU member states were conniving is that Azerbaijan has been very successful in respecting a sort of false narrative that the EU needs it, and that it is, and it has managed to sort of make its importance look bigger, probably, than it actually is. So what is your opinion about this, and how these false narratives can be countered? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a lot of questions, so I would like to make sure that Amanda can address them, and then we will do a second round.
Okay, on the question of engagement without recognition, I mean, we can see that since the war in Georgia, I mean, 2008, the Geneva process has brought about, you know, literally no results. It's just become a process of keeping the status quo. I mean, I think there is a reason to revisit this policy, engagement without recognition, because we've seen in other conflicts that it's been, you know, successful. And we also see the consequences of having no engagement, because over the last, you know, 7 or 8 years, there's been a consolidation of Russian influence in both South Ossetia and Abkhazia, including the recent, you know, obviously the 2 treaties that were signed, the integration treaties with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I think the EU is very, you know, misunderstood perhaps there, and there is a reason to have, you know, a different, more creative approach to the conflicts in the South Caucasus, and I also include Nagorno-Karabakh in that bracket, because what we have at the moment doesn't work. It only works for Russia. Sorry to say, you know, Igor, but I think that's a fact. It works for Russia and nobody else. So we need to look upon that in a different fashion. I mean, even the country I know best, Turkey, after 30 decades of, you know, strife, realized the only way they were going to resolve the conflict with the Kurds was to engage with the leader of the PKK terrorist organization. So I think this is something that needs to be reconsidered. On Azerbaijan, I mean, I don't believe in throwing countries out of policies. I'm not sure that would be the right thing to do either. But I mean, obviously, I think the EU is in a difficult situation with Azerbaijan, simply because what the Azerbaijanis actually want from the EU is actually very minimalistic. But at the same time, I do think the EU actually overburns this, you know, argument, oh, we need Azerbaijani oil and gas. At the end of the day, all the deals are signed, all the contracts are signed. You know, this 10 BCM is coming to Europe. You know, numerous countries have signed contracts. Azerbaijan can't back out of those contracts. I think the EU needs to sort of more man up in the messages that it sends, rather than having this, you know, very mixed approach. Because as I said, you have certain leaders of some member states that are just way over the top, I would say, with their adoration of President Aliyev, and this sends, you know, very wrong message. That's why you need to have more focus on dealing with grassroots organizations, with society. I mean, obviously with civil society it's very difficult now because most of it's in prison, but I think Azerbaijan is also coming to a period in its existence which is going to get more difficult. First of all, we know that Azerbaijan does not want to integrate with the Eurasian Union. It doesn't want to have any Russian influence in the country beyond what it absolutely has. This remains the same, so there's no way that Azerbaijan is going to be going back east. The other element is Iran. If there's a solution to the Iran nuclear program, you know, Iran's going to retake a significant regional role, and this is going to have a hell of an impact on Azerbaijan, more probably than any other South Caucasus country, because it's immediately going to reduce the benefit of Azerbaijan as a geostrategic link to Central Asia or an energy partner. So I think this will also reduce perhaps some of the adoration from the West towards Azerbaijan, and this also has to be considered. But I think the main thing is that the Eastern Partnership does divide 3 different ways. So you have 3 + 2 + 1, and policies with those countries are formulated based on the really objectives and interests and also values, and that isn't the case at the moment.
About sanctions. You know that there are several ways of sanctions against Russia. So it is very important to to mention this. And we know that many say that the best scenario for Donbass is a frozen conflict. It means that Russia will not fulfill Minsk II agreement. So, for instance, I cannot imagine that Ukrainian government will control the border between Ukraine and Russia in the end of 2015. So I think that sanctions will be maintained, simply. Of course, there is a problem of unity of 28 member states in this regard. And civil society support. I think that for these countries which signed the association agreement, EU should support, first of all, watchdog institutions there. Because, of course, we can press this country. But, first of all, the main tool should be a control within the EaP countries. And you know that society in those countries, especially in Ukraine, is ready to control authorities. It is a new phenomenon in post-Soviet countries. I don't speak about Baltic states. It is another example. But it is a new phenomenon. The kind of control from society side to authorities. And for those three countries, Belarus and Azerbaijan especially, I think that the role of European endowment for democracy should be much bigger than is today.
Thank you, Zsuzsanna. I'll just focus on James's very specific question about the military response, if you like. First of all, I have to be careful what I say because I'm doing some work on this for certain people. But what is hybrid warfare? Well, first of all, it has two purposes. One is to keep an adversary off balance, particularly open societies. And second, it's a prelude to war with open societies. So that's the two main functions it has. It has 7 lines of operation that we're looking at, which is Stratcom, cyber, use of conventional forces to force political decisions on borders, implied use of nuclear forces in a war-fighting role, strategic partnerships that are enforced, and also financial influence to undermine, say, the consensus of the alliance. So that if you have a consensus-based institution and countries are being influenced by money, you might not get that consensus, which makes agile decision-making in crises extremely difficult. And so we're looking at that. In a sense, it's war at the seams, James. And it's a war at the seams between collective defence, crisis management and cooperative security, very much aimed at open societies. Now, it's not that Russia has a centre looking at this. We know the people involved doing this. It also involves the Chinese. They're looking at this, certain other powers looking at this. It's the new 21st century way of warfare, which hasn't gone away and is very much still with us. Now, why the 2%? Several reasons. One is because of the transatlantic contract. The new batch of politicians in Congress with whom I treat often are not the old batch of congressmen and women. They really, trying to get NATO on the agenda in Washington these days, is actually very hard indeed. There's no automaticity. The question they ask me time and time again is, what are you doing for us? So this idea that we Europeans can free ride on the Americans indefinitely is dead. Second, the Americans themselves, because of sequestration primarily, they'll be down to $420 billion a year by 2020. Now that sounds a lot of money, and it is indeed a lot of money. But they themselves know that they look a bit like Britain in 1890. Very powerful on paper, but others choose when and how to complicate their strategic life. And when I was chairing Landcom, Aircom and Marcom the other day, one of the questions I put to them, so what do you do, guys, in the event of a major crisis in Asia Pacific with a simultaneous crisis in the Middle East or Eastern Europe, when we have to be first responders, be it NATO or the EU. What do we do? Do we have those forces? Right now we do. But if you look at the trend analysis, by 2020 we might not. And that's worrying. That's really very worrying, because when I had a conversation with the Lithuanian president a couple of months ago in Vilnius, and she put it to me bluntly, could we defend Lithuania? And I had to say, Madam President, I fear we would have to trade space for time. And that is not the answer she wanted to hear. But if things go on as they are, then that's going to have to be the reality. You know, right now, it's not just a question of expenditure. We spend on average in the EU 1.36% of GDP on defence. But of that, Britain and France alone are 50%. 88% of all defence R&T is Britain, France and Germany. We have an interoperability gap growing within NATO and the EU, and there are 16 EU member states spend 4 billion euros a year on defence, and by and large extremely badly. So we could squeeze a lot more out of our defence effort if we were more efficient. But the point of the 2% is to establish confidence in each other. And that's why, and I've said it very bluntly in the appropriate fora, when Prime Minister Cameron stands up in Wales and says, and lectures our NATO allies about the need to maintain 2% of GDP on defence, and then promptly announces that Britain will not be spending 2% of GDP on defence within a year, that rather, shall we say, undermines the fundamental contract upon which both the Alliance and the Union. And one final word, because I'm a strong supporter of CSDP. Why? Because if you look at a map of Europe, we will have to be effective responders in and around Europe. And it's an extremely rough neighbourhood. North Africa, Middle East, blah, blah, blah. There are places where you would not want to put a NATO or a US or a national flag. But having an EU flag on an operation communicates a different set of identities, which in complexity is as important as the force you deploy. So having having options for leaders, but having capabilities that can support options, has to be the defence planner's first dictum.
Thank you very much for the answers, and I would like to thank Amanda for joining us here today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
Since I saw that there are a couple more questions, we will do a short second round, but we will have to be brief as we are running over time already. Gentleman here in the first row.
Sebastian from Russian Embassy. After this session, I have really a more pessimistic view about our future relations in Europe, because what I have heard, just preparations for more sharper conflict, sanctions forever, then military preparations and so on, and dictatorship, even to dictate how OSCE can operate, because sometimes they are fault made because they are reporting about innocent people died in Donetsk and Lugansk, then the terror, political prisoners and so on, and then and this is can be considered as democratic values of Eastern Partnership. In some respect, we can consider this conflict in Ukraine as a result of Eastern Partnership. And this is the truth, unfortunately. Thank you.
Analytica, Central European University. This is conclusion of our event, and from the beginning was raised issue about possible cooperation with Eurasian Union, and I would like to ask for the conclusion. What's your opinion? It's clear was message that the sanction against Russia until the Crimea and other crises will be solved. But what about Eurasian Union cooperation? How do you think can be relations about? Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir, for your question. On Ukraine, there will be a negotiated settlement at some point, and there must be, and we must seek to move towards that. All I can tell you is from my conversation with leaders in the West, there's no appetite to spend more on defence. But, you know, we look at the 720 billion being spent between 2010 and 22 on the defence modernisation programme. We look at the Frunze Academy, we look at the reports post-Georgia, the assessment of the Russian military performance. We look at the deployment of Iskanders around borders, which are questionable in relation to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Missiles Treaty. We see things like Akula-class submarines appearing in the approaches to our Trident submarine base, which, by the way, although we didn't chase them away, we knew exactly where they were, even though they're meant to be silent. We knew they were there and exactly what they're doing. So taken together, your modernisation programme, some of which is legitimate, some of which is going very much further, 40% of all public investment now going into the Russian armed forces, and then the behaviour, as I said in my presentation, if we simply had the Ukraine crisis, and you were arguing from a position of saying this is about stability on your borders, this is about a complex environment, then perhaps we could have a dialogue about this, because although we would disagree with you profoundly, you would have a case to make. What we don't understand is when that is backed up by the aggressive use of force, snap exercises, Kaliningrad almost encircling the Baltic states, the constant testing of air responses over the Baltic states, over northern Norway, over the UK, the aggressive use of the Russian Navy at times into our own waters. Of course, you know, and I have to say bluntly, the Royal Navy is a far more modern fleet than the Russian Navy, and in any scrap, the Royal Navy would win. So I don't quite understand why the Russian Navy is even doing it. But so if you could take away the military posturing, and we could get back to simply discussing the crises from our respective perspectives, I think then we could move towards some negotiated solution of which the various institutions would then become part of the settlement. But as long as there is this military action going on around our borders, how would you expect NATO not to be sitting down, as I'm sitting down, and saying, right, how do we respond to this? What is the minimum level of force we need to have in place to deter any miscalculation? And I can only believe that sooner or later, even the cost of maintaining Russian forces at high readiness, which is enormous, must become so onerous that you will want to shift, or your government will want to shift its policy. The moment that this stops, I can guarantee you that we'll start talking about all the issues of contention between us. But whether you agree with me or not, as long as we feel we have a gun to our head, we will not talk, we will act. That's the bottom line. And you know, if you look at the Russian force, however, even the modernised force, much more professional force, the mobile force by 2020, you match that against NATO modern forces, it will not be a match for those NATO forces. So I think all of us have to get away from this and go back to some sensible diplomacy and get rid of all this gunboat nonsense, which frankly I cannot understand that any of us would benefit from. So I hope, given that we are both men of goodwill, that indeed that can be achieved.
Thank you very much.
Briefly, yes, maybe you are right that EaP is a reason for these problems in eastern Ukraine, but you know that it is a free choice of societies of EaP countries, also Ukrainian society, to integrate with the EU. And I think, and I told this, that Russia cannot accept this. It is a problem. It is, in my opinion, a root of this Russian-Ukrainian war in Donbass. And very briefly about EU relations, cooperations with the EU. I agree fully with James Nixey's opinion, which was presented during the second session. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank the panel for their contribution and for you for staying. And I would like to invite our director, Professor Péter Balázs, to the stage to give his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all the 18 people. I'm number 19, taking the floor out of the chair I had. In the first panel, we have collected a lot of new information and I hope a lot of inspiration for further research and thinking. We will send a message to various actors of that summit, which is taking place in 2 weeks from now. We'll decide together with the Latvian presidency. We had a short talk with the ambassador how to shape that paper and whom to address. Anyhow, to the Latvian presidency, and then we will think further. What will happen in Riga? I would like to make 3 final points on that. The first scenario is the traditional EU summit meeting. 28 states are sitting around, and this is a usual self-centric talking in the EU, which can base all action on the existing fundaments of the Eastern Partnership, not changing anything, but a lot of things can be done on that basis. State Secretary Nemeth mentioned the major financial reshuffling or upgrading the Eastern Partnership. Yes, it is possible. It is always possible to compensate political mistakes by money. The EU has money and could do a lot, because this is really disproportionate to compare the money spent for the Eastern Partnership and for some other issues. Somebody mentioned the Greek Eurozone action. We could extend the trans-European networks of energy, transport, environment to the neighbors and beyond. Why not Russia? Why not Central Asia? And going further, it's a question of money, fundamentally, and it would approximate neighbors. The visa issue is already more sensitive. This is again an intra-EU issue, because member states would consider the new wave of immigrants, the costs and risks of letting people pass uncertain borderlines on the eastern ends of Europe, and so on. And of course, the most exciting element, some European perspective or membership perspective, is even more sensitive, not only because Mr. Juncker said in his opening speech at the European Parliament last year that no new enlargement during his 5 years of Commission presidency. Member states can always change that, but it is not in the air. Eastern partners are a bit distant from complying with all the requirements of the EU, to make an understatement. And the major problem is that the EU at that level, beyond association, could handle only finished states, integral states. Once we made one mistake, we took a member without an integral and sovereign territory. I think it was a mistake, and we tried to handle that situation, but never again an incomplete state should be considered as a member. The only eligible candidate could be Belarus, with an integral territory, with no missing or disputed territories. That's what could be done within the actual framework of the Eastern Partnership. This is a question of role-taking of the EU and internal decision-making between and among the 28. All those who are a bit familiar with EU decision-making know how difficult because there are all kinds of side payments, compensations, and bargains and coalitions. What is the second stage? The second stage, if we are paying attention to those 6 countries sitting at the same table, to the Eastern partners as well, which is not the case in the first. The first is very inward-looking, traditional EU approach. In the second case, it's a question of reacting to what has happened, especially in Vilnius and after. We have a rather short story of Eastern Partnership. I had the privilege to be there in the room in 2009 when it was launched with a lot of optimism. Then Hungary elegantly skipped the Budapest summit and transferred it to Warsaw as a friendly gesture. Warsaw reconfirmed the original project, and then we came to Vilnius. Surprise, surprise, Ukraine didn't sign the association agreement. And since then, several things happened. The question is whether we have the courage and the political action to recognize that, in fact, this is a two-tier structure. Everybody knew that Belarus was a non-starter. There were discussions at the outset whether Belarus, how Belarus could be represented in Prague at the first meeting. Everybody knew that Azerbaijan is a lonely rider because it can afford it. And since then, we could see the segmentation of that. The question is whether we can recognize some of our mistakes. I think we overestimated the attraction of the EU on the periphery, on the outer periphery. It was not a question in Warsaw, Bucharest, or Budapest, whether the EU or any other. There was no alternative. In Kiev, in Baku, and so on, there are alternatives. Nobody has mentioned Turkey, but Turkey is there as well. So, and we underestimated the attraction of Russia. We started from a false hypothesis that those 6, which are the last eligible European candidates, are homogeneous. They are not. They have never been homogeneous. And it's not the first time I am saying this. We made a mistake with the name. Eastern Partnership is a misleading name. It sounds well in Brussels. It's Eastern, even for Poland. But in Kiev, the Eastern partner is Russia. So why to call this project Eastern Partnership? Why not European Partnership? If we focus on the problems of the Eastern partners, then we should deal much more with those forces opposing EU relations, and today we have learned more about the role of the Orthodox Church, some ethnic minorities which may feel marginalized because of the European tendency, and the kleptocratic people on power in some countries who are very much attached to the status quo and not interested in any change. And of course, Russia is behind, and Russia is not interested. And here I come to the third level. Whether those 28 EU and 6 Eastern partners would be able to deal with problems beyond the walls of the conference room in Riga, namely a very important player which is not represented there, and this is Russia. Russia was already there in Vilnius, and Russia will be there in Riga. The question is in what way those who are in the room can deal with problems attached to Russia. We are in a very serious conflict situation. In the post-Soviet area, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we've got a few what we called frozen conflicts, Transnistria and Nagorno-Karabakh. These are frozen. They are very different. The legal background, political background are very different in both cases. We have not deep, but maybe half-frozen conflicts with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are not yet deep frozen. They are moving. We have a very fresh conflict situation, the annexation of Crimea. This is a fresh event. And we have a hot war in eastern Ukraine. So these are very different temperatures of the different conflicts. It would be very complicated to put them on the table because there is no common denominator of them. But all of them are questioning the post-Cold War status quo. In diplomacy, when we have to settle a conflict of that kind, territorial dispute, then usually the first hypothesis is the status quo ante, whether there is any way to return to the status quo ante and how. This is not the case here. Then comes the next question, a new status quo. For Europe, for the post-Second World War Europe, it took 30 years to come to Helsinki and recognize the new status quo. It would take time. We have to live with some unsolved questions, but there is a real challenge. How could we shape a new security system for Europe, where Russia is a very important player? And here I come to the very last point. What kind of cooperation could we imagine with Russia? It's very interesting how Russia is copying the mistakes of the EU. The customs union. The customs union is a very old device, absolutely outdated, bad. Zollverein, which was the device of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and German unification of 1871. But there was nothing better at hand in the post-Second World War situation, so we took this oldie in order to shape Europe. Free trade is much more modern and much more efficient. But because the EU started the customs union, which is a good device to unite states, to frame Germany, not let Germany move. And it was accepted, but the customs union is blocking any other action, is centralizing not only customs revenues, but trade policy and policy in general. So it is not the best thing in the world, but it works with the perfection of West European governance experience. I don't think it would work with one big dominant power like Russia and with the given technicalities of the post-Soviet area like Kazakhstan and some others. It's not easy to make an old machine turn. Free trade is much better. Free trade is expanding in the world. Look at the Europe-US very difficult talks, the Trans-Pacific attempts of the US, and it gives liberty to the players to engage with several partners, to open channels. So I don't think it's a good thing. It's just imitating the EU, saying you are a customs union, then I am a customs union. But it would reduce negotiations to a Moscow-Brussels channel. And it would be very difficult to get a mandate in the EU for any talk of that kind. It would be much easier for Russia to give the order and take the partners at the negotiating table. I think some other solutions some trade deals, some networking would be much better. Yes, we have to maintain the idea of Great Europe, of Angela Merkel, to open this fantastic economic area from Lisbon to Vladivostok, to create trade instead of diverting trade, but the precondition is peace. The precondition is what was said at the outset, the peaceful settlement of conflicts. This would be the first, and then we could dream about Great Europe. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. We will shape a paper, and we will circulate among all the speakers. Session.